Thank you very much indeed for joining us to this another of our webinars. Our next practices live webinar. Today we have the honor and the pleasure to interview Stephen Bereaux, who is a very good friend of PURC's. And Stephen is Deputy to the Director, Telecommunication Development Bureau at the International Telecommunications Union. And before that, Stephen was a regulator. He worked in Trinidad and Tobago, and more recently, he was the CEO of the Utilities Regulation and Competition Authority of the Bahamas. So thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us today. And without wasting any time, I'd like to just go ahead and ask you a question to see if you could please tell us a little bit, for those who are not terribly familiar, what is it that the ITU is, and what does your division do?
Thank you, Araceli, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone on the call. It's good to see, I see many familiar faces, and obviously I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to be here with you. ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, is the UN specialized agency for telecommunications and information and communications technologies. It's the oldest UN agency, originally formed as a cooperative body between member states to address coordination around, actually beginning, I think, with international telecommunications cables. And then it's grown over the 150 odd years of its existence to develop into telecommunication standards. So that resulted in the formation of what we call the T sector, the telecommunication sector. The radio coordination of use of radio frequency spectrum globally. So that's resulted in the R sector, or radiocom sector. And most recently, the addition of development of telecommunications globally, resulting in the formation of the D sector, or development sector. And it's the D sector which, so like other UN bodies, the ITU is effectively a member state association, for want of a better word, based on a treaty between member states, but it also has other non-voting members, and they form the sectors. So the D sector, or development sector, has a secretariat called the BDT, or Telecommunications Development Bureau, which is the part of the ITU that I have the pleasure of being an employee or a staff member of. So the D sector, the ITU, the BDT supports the D sector's operations. And basically what the D sector is responsible for, in furtherance of ITU's mission to committed to connecting the world, the BDT and the D sector is responsible for primarily providing assistance to member states and other agencies in their efforts to connect their populations and to enhance their capacity to participate in the ICT world. I'm as you mentioned, a very, very new deputy to the BDT director, Ms. Doreen Bogdan-Martin, who is one of the ITU's 5 elected officials. And my role is threefold. I obviously support the director as her deputy, so occasionally act as her alternate or in her place when she's unable to be somewhere. I lead what's called within ITU the DDR department, which essentially provides administrative and operations support to the operations of the BDT. And I also lead the field coordination department, which is responsible for ITU's 14 or so area and regional offices globally.
Excellent. Thank you for giving us that description and giving us an idea and context. Stephen, what are the 2 biggest challenges that telecom operators face during the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. Limiting it to 2 maybe challenging, but just to start, obviously, telecommunications, and in particular broadband access, has become, I guess, in a sense, the electricity of this decade. It's a real necessity. As a former regulator, I remember being part of discussions about what was essential services. You know, when we talk about universal service and other things, we talk about services that are essential, USF type services. When we review those obligations. And as a multi-sector regulator, remember also comparing the level of necessity between sort of electricity and water and telecommunications, or broadband in particular. You know, 10 years ago, broadband was a luxury, or 15 years ago, it was a luxury. It was, and now we're looking at a world where You know, I remember saying I could live without broadband, but I can't live without electricity. That's no longer the case. You know, very soon we're gonna have to seriously consider broadband. Or right now we're considering broadband as just as important as those. And obviously there are a whole bunch of other issues. So I'm not making a regulatory suggestion here, but fundamentally during this pandemic, broadband access has become the glue that holds us together. It's become the oil or lubricant that facilitates commerce. Without broadband, businesses cannot function. And whether you're bricks and mortar or an online business, you cannot function now without broadband. So across the world, every commercial endeavor involves an online presence. So the biggest challenges that operators are having, firstly, obviously, capacity. So most activity, if not all, has gone online overnight. So there are capacity challenges due to significantly expanded usage. And all of this is within an increasingly uncertain future paradigm. No one knows what the situation is going to be like in 12 months. You don't know whether COVID is still going to be a problem or not. We don't know how much of this capacity is going to stay online in 12 months. And then there are new innovations popping up all the time to sort of shift our way of life, to help us to shift our way of life online. So things that almost weren't possible 6 months ago, a month ago in many countries are now becoming more and more online or ICT integrated, which again drives further and greater capacity. And there's this amazing shift overnight, an instant acceptance of a message that I know the ITU and many other organizations have been pushing for a long time, which is the need for connectivity, the need to connect all. And you know, there are still 3.7 billion people who don't have meaningful connectivity around the world, just under half of the population of the world, for broadband connectivity. So where the challenge that operators now have is this increase in capacity, which may drive or is driving an increased push toward 5G and new technologies and new investment. But all of this is happening within a global economic framework that is extremely uncertain. And in many ways, we are looking at depression type conditions globally, economically. So there's this drive to provide faster and faster and greater broadband capacity, but coupled with at the same time, a real challenge in global economic situations, and the ability of people to pay for these things is likely to start becoming more and more of a problem. So it's even further deepened the challenges that, you know, conversations like net neutrality were throwing up, you know, a short year or two ago, about how do we fund this broadband expansion in light of reducing revenues in so many areas. So that's one, although it probably sounded like more than one challenge, but that's one. And then the other thing I'd mention is there's this need for cheap broadband, and this need to connect the other 3.7 million has driven operators to be increasingly under pressure from governments to provide cheaper and cheaper and better broadband qualities. Again, in a very difficult economic paradigm situation.
That is, those are huge challenges indeed. In fact, my next question to you has to do with, you know, some of the hurdles that telecom providers have to overcome. One of them, as we see, is figuring out how they can learn from each other's experiences when they cannot travel and discuss as we're used to, like, you know, person to, like, you know, face-to-face kind of thing in person. And the other one is coordinating cross-country efforts to battle the pandemic. So in these hurdles, what kinds of things does your group do to help operators overcome such problems, such hurdles?
Yeah, thank you. This is, in so many ways, this is such an odd question, odd situation to be in for the ITU. You know, ITU's mission has been committed to connecting the world for a long time. And the work that ITU has been doing over the last several years has been to engage and encourage that dialogue. The mission of the ITU has always been meetings, it's international coordination of telecommunication standards, international coordination of radio communications, missions and capacity building workshops in countries around the world, in the developing world in particular, dealing with issues like cybersecurity, and generally doing everything you can to help countries develop themselves, but also to bring together the various stakeholders that are involved in this space, the experts, bringing experts together with industry associations, leveraging our relationships as a UN agency to bring together other bodies that are interested. So we have partnerships with WHO on mobile, Be Healthy, Be Mobile. We have partnerships with UNICEF on education, and bringing them in to help ICTs leverage development of all of the sort of sustainable development goals, but as an underlying thread. And what's happened is the immediate reaction to COVID, obviously, for most countries is lockdown. So overnight we locked down, and oddly enough, we were doing our work as an ICT agency in person, not really leveraging ICTs as much as one could to do that. So all of our meetings were physical in-person meetings, and we have quickly had to learn how to operate and carry out our mandate. So firstly, in an online or virtual environment. But the question for ITU fundamentally is, how do you continue to do your work when your work is more important than it ever was, but the mechanisms for doing it have changed, have no longer become possible. Nobody wants to be traveling, getting on planes to come meet in Geneva, as nice as that might be sometimes. So the first thing sort of that happened, and interestingly for my own self and just sort of telling stories, I joined the ITU and moved to Geneva 1 week before lockdowns happened pretty much everywhere. So I walked in, had 1 week in the office, and then proceeded to start working from home. But on my last day in the office, we were planning a drill for remote working. Thankfully, we were ready to do that. But the discussion for the directive was that it was time to set out a roadmap for us to see what were we going to do in a COVID lockdown world, because it was obvious that this was about to happen. How would ITU leverage its neutrality, which is a great thing, its global reach. Our member states, 189 across the world, and our long-standing role in telecommunication standardization, RF coordination, and telecommunications development. And this has given us one of the most comprehensive and diverse repositories of expertise. Through all of our relationships, ITU regularly brings together experts in all sorts of things, from AI to cybersecurity to, child online protection. So how do we leverage that to make sure that we help and protect the world that was coming, that was going to be online for the foreseeable future, and goodness knows when things would get back to normal. But that because of the level of unconnectedness was really still very unprepared for online life, for full online life, whether because of a lack of connectivity or a lack of training and capacity building or cybersecurity threats, or, there's any number of things we can talk about. And then also, how do we continue that work, continue the development, and also be prepared for what happens after, and to continue so that the world doesn't rubber band right back to physical life, so that there's a recognition that these tools are important and we shouldn't be caught whenever COVID is over, and if there's ever anything like it, in the same position we're in now. So our first step was, we talked about sharing platforms, which really was the critical thing. How do we continue our work to engage and share, and to create an environment where policymakers, regulators, industry players, associations, international organizations could come together. So we created a team that's our COVID response team, and we've engaged in a number of initiatives to essentially, before I even get there, the first thing we did was take all our meetings online. So we have now, similar to PURC and similar to many other organizations, we are running a fully online operation, fully remote. No one's allowed in our offices currently, and no one has been for some time. So all of our work is done remotely, and we've operated fully. In fact, I'm pretty sure I work considerably more now than I did when I could go into an office. I miss that leisurely walk to the office, and things like going for coffee. But we've done a number of things. So the first thing we did was our Reg for COVID platform, which it's a network resiliency platform is what we call it. But essentially it's #RegForCovid or regforcovid.itu.int. And through that platform, we provide a framework within which policymakers, and I want to just step back. It is a curated and moderated framework. So the information is verified and checked and so on. So you're sure you're not getting incorrect information. But where policymakers, regulators, operators, civil society, international agencies are able to share best practices, initiatives, questions, depending on what you have, because we have a discussion board. So it's just a coming together of the people who are involved in making and implementing what happens next. We've also leveraged our partnerships. So we've done more work with the UN system, so WHO. We entered. There was a broadband commission, which is one of the entities that the ITU is a partner in, had an immediate call to action in partnership with. So we did an agenda for action, and the Broadband Commission is a UN governmental agency. We also had we have a speedboat initiative that we do with the World Bank and GSMA, and there's a call for action there as well, in collaboration with a number of international partners. There's a long list, and I mean, you know, I can just point people at, you know, there's a dedicated ITU page. If you go to itu.int, we have collaborations in Africa with WHO. We're doing a lot of work. We did a lot of work with Smart Africa on their putting out to develop an app for the return to business after COVID. We have our GIGA initiative with UNICEF, which is about connecting schools, and we're now seeking to expand that to connecting students to schools, because obviously that has become a huge issue. So we're trying to find funding for that at the moment. And we recently wrapped up a series of 5 webinars with the UN Assistant Secretary General for Telecommunications, Fabrizio Hochschild. We wrapped up a series with his office on webinars. Yesterday's was about human rights policy, and we've done a number of initiatives with them. So, and we continue to just find ways to share information and to leverage our community of experts and agencies and involved people.
That's amazing. I'm sure you're going to get a ton of questions from the audience today about those initiatives. And I hope this serves as a reminder to please go ahead and start posting your questions if you have any on the chat. And as Sam said, we can always ask you for questions using the microphone later too, if you're willing to do so as well. But don't let those questions go to waste. Stephen, I have another question, and it has to do with, as you know, we're trying to help by being somewhat of a link and understand, what telecom regulators need to know right now about how telecom operators are coping. So what should telecom operators, or rather, what should telecom regulators know about how telecom operators are coping with the pandemic? What should they know?
Well, there's a lot that they should know, and I think I want to sort of avoid answering the question. So I'll answer the question in a what should they do? I think what is critical, and this more than anything, we've discovered through. We're doing analysis and some data mining through our Reg for COVID site, trying to take it to the next level and really assess what we have. But one of the key things is about the interaction with operators, between regulators and operators, policymakers and operators at this time. I don't think any regulator should forget that your country, your stakeholders are almost completely reliant on these networks. And the networks can be impacted in so many different ways. We've had stories of network tower vandalism because of false information about 5G and people blaming 5G for the pandemic. We've had reports from network operators who have complained about inability to access their towers and facilities because of lockdown provisions that didn't take them into account. There's obviously strained financial situations, because not only are regulators have non-payment of debt been a significant on the increase, so there's much more unpaid debt. There's also much less access to funding for things that aren't COVID related, because the money shortage is everywhere. So in those countries, especially where governments haven't dipped heavily into their coffers and thrown money at their populations, there is a real strain on financing, both commercial, both public and private sector financing. So operators who have, a lot of operators were in the middle of planning investment. So upgrades to 5G and other things that are going on, which have been impacted adversely by what's happening, or maybe which are being accelerated. But I think one of the key things, when we first looked at the Reg for COVID platform, we did one of the things we have to do internally is we have to do intersectoral coordination, which, like the ITU, many things have long names and they're really meaningless. We had to talk to other people in the organization. And fundamentally, that intersectoral coordination, we had a very interesting engagement with some of our colleagues in the Radio Communications Bureau, because they were not concerned about COVID. They were like, you know, well, spectrum is still spectrum. No, nothing's changing in spectrum usage. There might be some access, you know, actually the patterns with people no longer going to work, spectrum usage has actually become less of a problem and so on. We had this long conversation, but where it got to at the end was that it's really impossible to predict what the impact is in a particular country unless you're in that country and you're actually talking to the people who are involved. Because a country situation could depend so much on what kind of policies your government has put in place for lockdown, for example. That can significantly impact who goes to work, who doesn't go to work, where congestion patterns are, whether businesses need better broadband or whether it doesn't matter. So many things can be impacted by the local situation. So what we have focused our own attention on, and what we believe it's incumbent on everyone to focus on, is engagement. Don't think that the operators, that it's business as usual. Engage, and engage frequently and engage constantly with operators, government, other entities that might be operators, whether it's civil society, groups that might be able to just give you an idea of what's going on in your country. And, you know, it's really a time for innovative solutions. This is not, I don't think there's a best practice guide that can be written. We've been trying unsuccessfully so far because it's impossible to say what best practices are. The most you can say is these are tried practices. You know, they've tried something there. We're back into the phase of trial and error regulation in many ways, I think, where policies and regulations are being tried, because even if there were pandemic plans before, I don't think any of them looked like this. I heard a reference the other day, someone said this was a perfect virus. It's like it could not have been better engineered if it was engineered, and that's not to start any conspiracy theories about it. But it's a perfect virus because of the way it spreads. It's quiet. It's a quiet virus. So, you know, I would say that what operators and what regulators need to do is to recognize that you don't know the answer to the question you haven't asked yet. So you need to ask those questions. You need to go back to it. I feel like I've said that somewhere before, but fundamentally, that's the question. That's really it. It's the questions that you need to ask.
That is precisely why we think that these webinars, well, why we call these webinars next practices, because we haven't been here before, and because we are all figuring it out. And what we're doing is just testing. We're doing experiments that we need to learn from. So yeah, those are exactly the reasons why we're doing these webinars, so that we can all get together and have a forum to share what we're doing and what we're learning from what we're doing to improve things and to change and adapt as we need. So having said that, Stephen, I have another question for you, and this may be a little futuristic in a way, but I know you've mentioned that you're working on some initiatives kind of looking towards the future. So what do you think will be the biggest lessons from the pandemic?
Well, that's a very good question, and I don't know if I know. Is it possible, by the way, to share screen? I just would like to show a picture. Is that possible? Can you,
Yes, Stephen,
Samantha,
yes. Yeah, I don't think that would be a problem at all. If you
can, I just borrow. I just want to show a picture on the screen. But you know, the question, we have to learn to live in a new world age. So you know, lessons from the pandemic, really, it's firstly that ICT access, broadband access, is not a luxury anymore. And we do have to remember that while everyone on this call clearly has good broadband, because you're all participating in this, that there are still 3.7 billion people billion people who are not meaningfully connected, who cannot be part of this. And you know, the UN has just finished the Sustainable Development Goals. So from a sustainable development perspective, we're still at UN level. ICT is treated, or broadband is treated, as a undercutting, sort of cross-cutting thing, but it's not actually a specific sustainable development goal anymore. So connecting the world is still something that is treated as an optional thing, or rather as a goal. Where I think, so the first lesson has to be that before the next pandemic, we really have to connect the world. And the work that needs to be done, it is not impossible. There are technologies that are being trialed. You know, it's amazing how quickly things have been rolled out. I know Luna is doing a lot of work in Kenya. There's other things like that that are done to be able to connect the unconnected, and there's still a lot of them. So that's one, it's that that concept of connectivity for all really becomes more and more important. Secondly, I think one of the other lessons is, you know, one of the, certainly the things I find most amazing about this pandemic is the almost instant impact, I'm sure short term, on climate change, on, well, at least on pollution, at least that aspect of, we don't know whether it's climate change, I'm not a scientist, but certainly the benefits of increased technology usage should be looked again at. And I'm sure if we can find a new resting point after the pandemic, it then allows for us, I think, to you know, be more responsible. And I think we will get something positive out of that. Thirdly, the impact of technology on people. So technology is fantastic. You know, it's great that we can have this engagement online, and you know, it's fantastic. But there is a real psychological impact on people, on the use of people because of the use of technologies. There's a psychological impact on us all as we take more and more of our lives online, and less and less of our lives is in person. So there are certainly a lot of issues around that. And then the last comment I'd make is there's certainly a lot more widespread appreciation for things like the need for child online protection, cybersecurity, enhancement. These are things that I think much more of our populations have become aware of. And it's a real opportunity. And again, back to this dialogue, these next practices talks, it's a real opportunity while people are listening for us to re-engage on many of the topics that have been, you know, understood, but not really, that haven't gained traction globally. So that after this, we have a safer, more effective, more efficient, and a better online environment, and a healthier online environment.
Excellent. Well, Stephen, I have some more questions for you, but I would like to go ahead and start taking questions from the chat so that we make sure we take care of as many of these as we can. So I have a question here that was sent to me. It says, in light of the fact that telecoms and ICTs depend on energy to function, how is the ITU using its influence to improve energy supply to support the provision of telecommunication services, which are critical now more than ever?
Unfortunately, I really do not know the answer to that in detail, and I'm going to be completely honest. I know there is a lot of work that's going on in the innovation, some of the sectors in the development work. There is a lot of development work that is done in the context of smart, sustainable cities that are designed and work toward providing innovative solutions. I don't have the facts at my fingertips, but we do. I know the D sector does a lot of work under the rubric of smart cities and innovation that assists communities to have better energy supplies and so on. But I don't know the specifics. I can actually get that information. So if someone, you know, I'm emailable, stephen.bereaux@itu.int. I'd be happy to get a more detailed answer, because I know there is work going on in that area.
Excellent. We have another question here from Sydney. Sam, you can probably see the question. I was wondering if Sydney would like to maybe ask that question through the microphone. I'll be very happy to read it as well. But he has a bit of an explanation, and maybe he'd like to share that with us. I think we can all learn from his comments and the large question in the end.
Sure. Sydney, I've unmuted your audio if you can hear us, if you'd like to share and directly speak back and forth with Stephen and Araceli.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Stephen, wonderful presentation thus far. Yeah, my question is what lengthy? I think that's why I was asked to verbalize it. I'm sorry for that. In your earlier address, you indicated, and it's known to us as regulators, that almost half or a little more than half of the world's population doesn't have access to broadband services in one form or the other. And especially with the lockdown, that is definitely an issue. Has the ITU looked at business models in terms of how to garner that access in a more, in a cohesive manner? And an idea that I threw out in my question is that that access to internet would be free, but you pay for the services that you get from the internet, so that at least the people who are connected to it. So if a child that needs to look up any kind of information for schoolwork, that it can be done, similar to going to a library, which is free access to the library and to the information. But now, because of the lockdown and going into the future where we are supposed to be a more connected world, that that information can be garnered for free, whether you have access, yes or not. Another to that point as well is that the potential business model is that the companies, they similar to what, like, let's say a 1-800 number, where you can a client can call that number for free, but the company pays a fixed fee to the operator, whether it be a monthly or a yearly basis, whatever charges that derives from, so that the customer, having credit or not, can obtain service, can obtain information from that company. So a similar business model to the internet or to broadband access. Is that something that ITU is also looking at or potentially can explore?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I wish I could sort of go back and forth between my ITU hat and my regulator hat. And I'm just going to explain a small difference between the two, right? So I think I might have mentioned neutrality as a ITU body being neutral. So I'm gonna I'll tell a little bit of a story, because your proposal has some significant implications around an ongoing debate that I'm sure many, if not all of you, will be familiar, and that's net neutrality. So much of the answer kind of lies in an ongoing debate around net neutrality. And I'm recalling specifically when we were negotiating the call for action on Speedboat, which involved GSMA, which obviously is an operator's agency, the World Bank, which is a bank, a funder of things, the ITU, which is a neutral technical agency, and why am I forgetting the other? There's one other agency, and it's slipping my mind. But just to say that one of the conversations, one of the requests by one member of that group was that governments, in the call to action, governments should consider relaxing or waiving net neutrality restrictions to allow for funding to come from sources other than, to allow for broadband funding to flow in that way, because those net neutrality discussions have in fact limited the extent to do that. So the suggestion, the 800 model kind of is depending on what position certain countries have taken on net neutrality, could be an issue. So I think that certainly is being considered and has been considered by many countries. And I know that there are ITU study groups that look at that issue. And I know that it's been, there are a lot of models around who pays for access that have been considered and that are available for consideration. I cannot endorse or suggest that any one is better than any other because of the neutrality issue. But I would say that it's certainly a very good point for regulators and governments and policymakers to consider. And in fact, that's where we ended. We said, that's a national point. That's a country issue that countries can decide, but the models and the expertise and the advice is there. But you will find that there are different entities some of them quite large commercial entities that will have completely different positions on whether that's an appropriate and viable model, depending on what their own business models are, and that can impact other business models. That may be a non-answer, so to the extent that it is, I apologize, but I do have to avoid suggesting that I have a position on it.
Hey, thank you. It's understood. I agree with you. Just one more, not to get into any further discussion, but the 800 model I was suggesting was more for the individual company, for their clients, to be able to have access to their services, so or at least pay for their services. And I'm looking at utility companies, for instance, because of the lockdown, that they're not able to come in, or even telecoms companies, as a matter of fact. So not able to come in to pay the bills, or may not have, and that's another subject for a discussion point for a different forum, I think. But and especially in the Caribbean, where I'm from, and greater part of the developing world, a lot of people don't have electronic accounts, so banking services and stuff like that, right? So having the company themselves pay for the access in terms of an 800 number type scenario that allows the client to be able to get service or pay for that service without them having or needing directly access to broadband.
Sorry,
so
that, yeah, you're right.
No, it's all right. Honestly,
I think in fact that does actually exist. I know there are many mobile operators, for example, who offer free data for things like bill payment. So that is I think that model does actually exist, and I think it's often done in that way, where there's free access for specific things like bill payment. It's just similar to the free access for WhatsApp that you get with some packages. But that sounds like an interesting model, again, that countries should consider. And this is why I make the point that dialogue between regulators and operators in countries is critical. Because, as a regulator, you don't necessarily understand what issues even the public are having. So it's useful to speak to the operators who often have a different perspective about usage. I remember one discussion thinking that mobile money was a great idea and that the problem was the operators, only to discover that it was really a totally different issue, which I won't get into. But speaking to the operators and that dialogue, I think, is critical, especially at a time like this where things are changing so fast.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stephen. Sam, I'm wondering if there's anybody else who may have raised their hands that may want to ask Stephen any questions at this point. Otherwise, I do have some, but I want to hear from them all first.
Sure. Yeah, we don't have any hand raising just yet, but I'll be sure to keep a close eye on it and just flag you if we do. And I'm not sure, Charlie, if you can hear us. I know you had sent a few messages within the chat. Would you be willing to share with us? I've unmuted you if you can hear me. Charlie?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
We can, yes. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. I'm in from South Africa, and I really just wanted to resonate with the issue that was raised initially in the chat, but I think Stephen raised it as well, about the real challenge of connecting the majority of our people. If a country like ours, dealing with a situation where the majority of people do not have access to the internet at home, let alone access to broadband. So there are a number of very important initiatives that need to be taken to ensure that that access can be done. And I think it would be very useful for the ITU to do some look at some of those kind of practices. For example, our Competition Commission recently tried to persuade the operators to hand out what they call lifeline data to consumers. It really hasn't flown. People have tried to get around it by free data access to proprietary platforms and services, and by using free data for zero-rated websites. And that's, of course, another minefield of issues and challenges. So just a comment from my side.
Actually, may I? I just wanted to raise something else in the context of one of the changes that we've been noting. And, you know, the BDT, and just in the context of connecting the other 3.7 billion, which is actually quite encouraging, is that one of the challenges that we have had as the ITU, as the BDT in particular, is the challenge of raising funds, of raising money for the projects and initiatives that we carry out around the world. You know, if you go to the international sort of donor market and say, I'm raising money to fight AIDS in Africa, or HIV/AIDS, or starvation. Previously, obviously, that was easy. You could get access to hundreds of millions, potentially billions of dollars. But if you go saying, I want to connect the 3.7 billion African people who don't have connectivity, or billion developed country people who don't have connectivity, the reaction was less so. It was like, well, that's a commercial problem, really, isn't it? You know, that you know, companies do that. We don't want to step on the toes of companies, really. Business should do that. So previously, I mean, you know, connectivity, broadband connectivity was very much treated as a commercial issue. And that, in some ways, us as regulators over the last few decades, and the ITU itself in the denationalization or liberalization of telecommunications, we kind of created that paradigm where we said, no, this should be left to business. So the donor market kind of heard that, and they think it should be left to business as well. But we've been doing a lot of work on resource mobilization, trying to get access to funding and trying to enhance BDT's effectiveness in connecting the unconnected through access to funding. And we are finding that one of the consistent messages coming out during the COVID pandemic is that, you know, ICT, or broadband connectivity, is now again becoming a headline global issue, which actually can start attracting increased funding, because that is one of the other ways. There is an enormous amount of donor funding available that could go a long way, Charlie, in your country or in other countries, to connect the unconnected. So hopefully, one of the things we will see next, I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the changes hopefully that we will see is a greater global effort toward connecting unconnected people.
Excellent, thank you, Stephen. I'm sorry, Charlie, did you have anything else to add to that, or?
He muted, so I think, yes, so I think that was good. I do have a question though, Stephen, for you. Someone submitted, Antoinette. She's not going to be sharing video or audio, but I'll go ahead and ask the question. She said, any advice regarding 5G hysteria?
You know, it's one of the age-old regulator challenges has been the whole issue of what does RF do to humans. 5G hysteria is clearly just 5G hysteria, and it is amazing how quickly it took off. It's taken off. And what's scary is that 5G is actually one of the answers to many of the issues we have. In this COVID situation, we are extra reliant on fast broadband, and fast mobile broadband of the type that 5G promises could continue to help sort of be transformational in the event that this goes on or it happens again. All I would say is education, you know, I mean, having a stronger message and getting it out there. There have been a lot of things happening generally. I've noticed changes in sort of WhatsApp approaches to sharing and so on that have helped to, I think, slow the spread of fake news. So, you know, I think combined with a concerted information effort by regulators and governments, that's really all you can do, is tell people the truth and hope they'll listen to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I do have another question, maybe going back a little bit, one step back to the previous conversation we were having, and that, Stephen, has to do with again the future of whatever we, you know, think could happen after this. But how do you think the pandemic will change telecommunications worldwide? Let me say that a little louder again. I've heard that my microphone is a little low. So how do you think the pandemic will change telecommunications worldwide?
You know, I guess to gather some of the points that we've been making, that have been made, One is, I think we'll get serious about connecting the other 3.7 billion. I think governments around the world will understand that, you know, there has to be a shift. Telecommunications is it already underlies pretty much every other development goal. I mean, the 17 SDGs, they recognize that telecommunications is an underlying thing that helps facilitate delivery of all other goals. But I think more than ever, our leadership has to recognize that, you know, telecommunications is truly essential, and that overnight it can become essential. You know, when I woke up on the 6th of March to fly to Geneva, I did not think that the only way to communicate and get around would be like this. But by the 16th of March, I was effectively stranded, you know, and that's the life, that's a 10-day period within which we had to completely adjust our way of life and become reliant on telecommunications. We are talking in countries where we're doing some work right now, trying to arrange WTDC 21. It's a year and a half away in Ethiopia, and having issues around having to postpone elections. The Ethiopian government's dealing with elections issues. You know, goodness knows, I think your country is due to enter an election season, and you've seen changes in that cycle. So every aspect has to be changed. So it's not so much that telecommunications will change. I think it'll be the same tools. Hopefully someday they'll come up with a Zoom tool that allows for full interaction. And you know, one of the comments I think we were talking about a few days ago was, you can't replace a full meeting with a Zoom tool, because it's not really possible to treat it like a room. I can't just walk around. I can't have an independent conversation with one person or two and little groups to engage. We can't do that by Zoom. So it's either we get back to physical meetings, or we find ways to enhance these tools to become even more like real life. And, you know, I mean, I'm a sci-fi freak, so I'm sure there's all sorts of possibilities that I think of from my sci-fi reading and watching. But those are the things that I think are going to happen. But for those to happen, we need things like 5G. We need more investment in telecommunications to really enhance and enable a full experience through these technologies, if that's the direction we end up having to go in. And we don't know what's going to happen next. So I think it's not so much that the technology will change, although I think it's going to advance faster, and we'll find new ways, even more new ways to engage. But it's really that our mindset about the technology will change. And I think I've alluded to some of the things like greater attention to cybersecurity, children online. How is online schooling over an extended period impacting the next generation of kids? You know, what's going to happen? Are they going to go straight back to school? And if they don't, how will their perspective on the world change compared to ours? These are things that I think will be with us for decades to come. The thing that I was going to show is a meme from Star Trek, where one of the young Star Trek people is asking why doors don't have handles, and he says, "Let me tell you about 2020." You know, so there's all these things that are going on that are going to have a lasting impact on our life. And I think we really do. We just have to keep talking about them, because I don't think we can really even guess what they're going to look like. But I think there's a lot of idea throwing out that has to happen, so that when it does happen, we will at least have thought about it and seen it as a possibility.
Thank you very much for sharing. Indeed, Sam tells me that we have a hand that has been raised.
Yes, we do. Yes, thank you so much, Araceli. So it looks like I have Sydney's hand raised. Sydney, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your audio right now, and please feel free to share your video if you'd like. Just let me know if you can hear us. Sydney?
Okay. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Stephen, just to chime in on what you spoke to Mr. Lewis about in terms of the funding, that ITU is having issues with funding, and how is it comparable to, let's say, for instance, a award goes out for funding for AIDS programs and you get immediate help, and then for telecom services or connectivity, it's a struggle. And I totally agree with you 100% with that. But I think also part of the I want to say, I can't use the word blame. I don't want to use the word blame, but I think part of the issue with that is that telecom is still not seen as a utility or as a, I don't know what the correct word would be, a mainstay of our society, and especially in these times, right? And it even speaks to the UN, where the SDGs, telecom is not mentioned. Telecom is used to achieve the SDGs, but it's not mentioned as a primary goal in order for the world to flourish. It's only used as a means to achieve a goal, but not actually a goal itself. So I think that's where part of the problem is, or at least a good deal of the problem is, whereas the ITU is seeking funding or getting recognition to connect the rest of the world. And your thoughts about that?
Well, I completely agree. I think, and that's something that I have seen changing. So I do agree, the discussion and negotiation of the 17 SDGs and telecoms not being one of them, because it was in the MDGs in a different way. So telecoms not being one of them is a very interesting and long story. And for some people, they thought it was a win because telecoms is this thread that goes through all of them. But then obviously it hasn't resulted in the kind of global impact or global effort to connect that we would hope for, and hence why the ITU and others have had things like the Broadband Commission to try to engender it. I think the next decade we'll see some changes, but I don't think the SDGs themselves alone, or rather, I don't think the bigger issue is not so much the SDGs, it's just the obvious change in the world that has happened now. So that, as I said, we already are seeing a lot more interest from other UN entities, for example, the funding, the donor type agencies and so on, who I mean, immediately throughout March, the number of emails and outreach that my boss was getting from other entities just wanting to partner with the ITU, all of a sudden everyone knows the ITU. All of a sudden everybody wants to be part of this telecoms world, and I think that's a good, I think it's a very good indicator, hopefully, of what will happen after this. But it's also a bit of a call to action for us to make sure that we don't let the pressure fall off, that we don't let people forget, and because the problem with telecommunications is it's not an immediate problem until it's an immediate problem. So those of us who've spent time in the Caribbean know a hurricane comes along and all of a sudden communications is important. But until then, it was like, oh, well, it's okay, we can get by. So I think that's really the issue. It's too easy to forget telecommunications and to forget those who aren't connected until the day when COVID or some disaster comes along. And that was one of the interesting learnings for us, right? We had the ITU published its guidelines for emergency telecommunications plans for countries on the 19th of March. And the guidelines before COVID only spoke to natural disasters. And we had to go do some quick work to acknowledge that pandemics are an equally significant disaster, because, you think Ebola when you think pandemics, you think of something that's kind of, a lot of people will die very quickly. This silent virus is a totally different thing, because what it's done is just crippled life without actually taking that many lives by comparison. And I don't mean that to belittle the number of lives that have been lost, but it's crippled everyday life. And that's not, I think, what most disaster plans were prepared for in the context of an endemic or pandemic.
Very good. Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm not sure, Sam, if we have any other raised hands, but we're coming up to our time limit here. So maybe we have question for, time for one more question, but I'm not, yep. Do we have any?
Sure. Yeah, so as of right now, I don't see any more hands raised, but if anyone has any questions or comments, of course, please feel free to either raise your hand or submit those to the chat function, and we'd be happy to address those within the next few minutes before we conclude our session.
Very good. All right, well, thank you all very, very much. Thank you so very much, Stephen. It's always great to see you, and it's been an excellent session. Thank you very much for sharing so much with us today and answering all those questions and comments. And well, we'll be in touch soon. Everybody, please do take good care. And
good to see lots of friends from the region. So, you know, hi from Geneva.
Hi, Stephen.
So thank you all very much again for joining us.